Yay! Hello, everyone. Welcome to this StreamYard with me and James Nottingham. Just to kind of introduce myself first, and then I'm going to hand over to James. I'm Becky Carlson. I run two learning communities called Learning Pioneers and Press Play. James has worked a lot with us. And is that your dog, James?
I'm sorry, that's two of my 5 dogs. Yes.
They're very welcome. Invite them in.
Thank you. Okay.
So, James and I we met in person in Perth last year, not in England, in Perth. And I was so resonated with so much that you had to share, James. And there were, just so many important points that you made, and the way that you link that with the meta research just really grabbed me. So I'm really excited to do this StreamYard together. So would you like to introduce yourself, James?
Thank you, Becky. Lovely to see you again. Yeah, I'm James Nottingham. I created the Learning Pit many years ago, and I am mostly interested in why some students don't learn very well, whereas other students are learning well in the same classrooms. I was in that first category of the not learning very well, and I didn't do very well at school at all. And yet a lot of my mates did, and we had the same teachers, same approach, and so on. So that's always fascinated me. And I am particularly interested in pedagogy. Generally, I have, and I've started creating lots of videos on pdod.com. But I spend about 50% of my time teaching, and 50% of the time creating videos and writing and consulting.
Thank you, James. So, we could talk about many things. We've done a live with you on looking at the links between how can inquiry be challenging, which I think is a really good subject, provocation, reflection. So that's in Learning Pioneers in our Australasian hub. So, that's a conversation that really interests me. But we've picked this one in particular: is direct instruction enough? And particularly due to the kind of world climate, or like things that are happening in education, where in quite a few parts of the world, teachers are being asked to really fully focus on direct instruction, and it kind of feels at the detriment to other learning approaches that are also nourishing and can be helpful. And from my perspective, that's a really important discussion. Number one, because I love nuance, and I think it's really important to dive into the nuance of teaching and learning, and value the craftsmanship of being an educator. But number two, obviously, I've come from teaching in mostly early years, year 1, year 2, and I can only imagine what it must feel like as a teacher in a classroom when that's the top-down instruction. It's the kind of instruction that would have encouraged me to leave teaching. So I'm feeling a lot of empathy and compassion for educators who are being asked to do this, and wanting to create an opportunity for them to articulate their pedagogy, what they're doing in classrooms and why, so that they can stand true to their values and beliefs and what they know will be most nourishing and most inclusive for the children in their classrooms, linking back to what you were saying about why some children do well in school and others don't. So why is this discussion important to you, James?
Well, any discussion that you want to start, Becky, is important. And I know that sounds as if I'm just being sycophantic. I'm not. I have never heard you ask a question that isn't important, I think, in education and isn't fascinating to me. So that's the first part, is let's be interested in education. And so I think that's important in and of itself. But thinking about direct instruction, I think there are so many strong benefits and necessary aspects of direct instruction. But you know that my background is inquiry, and so many people would see that as the antithesis of direct instruction. and yet they are very complementary and can sit together very, very comfortably indeed. So I think for me, the important aspects of a discussion around direct instruction is, number one, what is it? Because it's not chalk and talk. And a lot of people think it is, and it really isn't chalk and talk at all. And number two, how then does it sit with other approaches to pedagogy?
Yeah, 100%. And it's that clarity around what it is and what it isn't. And you were kind of alluding a little bit there to a kind of a bit of a divisionary narrative that started in education, which wouldn't even occur to most educators in everyday classrooms to even be part of. And I'm thinking back to my kind of first days teaching, and I worked in a brilliant school here in Bristol. I was so grateful to just land on my feet, basically. But all of the teachers in the school were incredible teachers, like all of them. And they had, I would call it like a palette of learning. They had an incredible palette of learning and they knew exactly when to draw in different elements of that from that palette to create these kind of different mixes of learning for the students. It wouldn't have even occurred to them to think about, kind of separating all of that out and saying, let's just do one of those. It just, and that's the same for most teachers in most classrooms, I find. I don't know if you do, but when I was working in Bangkok and speaking with teachers in Bangkok, it was just about doing great teaching. There wasn't a kind of let's just do this and there's only one way, and a very strong kind of pushy attitude behind that, which can be quite scary on a kind of when you're on the receiving end of that. So there's kind of an attitude and an energy that can come with that too, which is kind of like a power over dynamic. And you use the word curiosity. And I think that's the antidote to all of this, is being open and curious and wondering and gaining that. So this is what this is about for me, gaining conscious competence in our practice and leadership. So knowing exactly what we're doing and why, and having a mastery around that. And if we're able to articulate that, for me, this is why I built Learning Pioneers. No outside agency can come in and say, you have to do it this way, because you know exactly what you're doing and why. And I'm thinking a little bit actually about North Harrisdale, because that's one of the places I first heard you talk in Perth, and how intentional they are with their palette of learning and approaches, and how visiting classrooms in North Harrisdale, you could see the children were so engaged. It felt so inclusive. And one element I thought was really strong there was their P4C lessons, philosophy for children, and just how, again, talking of nuance, how children were so accepting of one another's perspectives, and they just loved like changing their minds and building on one another's ideas. And I think I was in a year 6 class, and you could see the kids were just so fluid in what they were doing because they'd done it for years. So there's one example of part of that palette of learning. Imagine if many, if not all, schools were developing philosophy for children and the kind of minds that would develop as a result of that. And if you only teach through direct instruction, you're missing out on that, for starters.
Yes, agreed. I think of all the things you've said there, I think the most important aspect in relation to the topic that we're talking about is that variety, is that palette, as you called it, and drawing on that palette for different purposes, different times, for different needs. And I don't think it's coincidental that the schools you've taught in, Becky, have done that very well, and the schools that we love, for example, North Harrisdale, they do that brilliantly well, drawing on that palette. I do think, though, also there's a huge proportion of our profession where the pedagogy of a teacher, of a single teacher, rather than taking the whole group, but one teacher, is somewhat familiar every day. It's almost the same approach every day. And I'm not trying to run down our colleagues here at all, but I do think that we've all got experiences, and I'm hesitating here to even mention the term, particularly in high schools, but I do think that there are particular history teachers who teach inquiry-led almost always, whereas there's another history teacher in the same department in the same school who's almost all about delivering lectures almost. And I don't mean to sound disparaging about lectures, because lectures can actually be very, very, very useful depending on how the students are responding and what the engagement techniques are that are being used, and what they are expected to do with it. But nonetheless, I think it would be honest to say that there's a large proportion of our profession who have a favoured pedagogy. And it might even be that it's done never to the exclusion of, but certainly one pedagogy is amplified and others therefore are almost as if they're guest appearances now and again. Whereas generally, not always, it depends who and what you're teaching, but I think generally speaking, having the palette approach, the smorgasbord approach, where you are very wisely choosing the pedagogy for the purpose and the context, I think is very, very important indeed. Now, if I might connect into this idea of direct instruction, and quick aside there, some people, the purists, will get a bit wobbled by using the term direct instruction, because that's actually a very identifiable program that was created by Engelman in the 60s, maybe the 70s, I think 60s. And so a lot of people will call it explicit instruction rather than direct instruction. But I'm not a purist, as you know, Becky, so I'm quite happy. But I do want to say that just in case we've got some purists listening in and go, whoa, hang on a minute, are you talking DI, or are you talking that broader sense of explicit instruction? And I think at the heart of explicit instruction is this idea of I do, we do, you do. There are lots and lots of very deliberate checks for understanding of every single student. And if I'm honest, I don't think we're particularly good at that in our profession, of checking for understanding for all of our students, and then checking with a formative lens on it. So I'm checking for your understanding so that I know what you need next, and then I build my next steps in instruction from that. So that's one part of explicit instruction that is absolutely baked into it, is there very, very rigorous checks for understanding. Second of all is the principle that you do not allow a student to move from guided practice to independent practice until you are convinced that they've got stable understanding or knowledge or skill set that is accurate and clear, that they can then practice. So in other words, it is very, very mindful of making sure that no student practices the wrong things. And so I think that can be different to inquiry, because inquiry, we allow ourselves to play with possibilities. And some of those possibilities might actually be wrong. They might be based on misunderstandings. And at the moment that they appear, typically a facilitator of inquiry doesn't correct it. Now, she or he asks very, what shall we say, deliberate, thoughtful questions to get students to reflect and to connect and to apply, such that they come round to the idea, oh, hang on a minute, hang on, that wasn't right, was it? Because, and it's that sort of creating that eureka moment that we are in inquiry, whereas in explicit instruction, it's not eureka, it's here's how it is, and here's the important aspect that we need to know, and here's how we need to process this and use it and practice this. So I would be, and I'm going to just use those two because I do think they're not polar opposites at all, but they're either side of the palette. You know, they're not overlapping very much at all. They are quite on the sort of the either side of the palette. I think those two approaches are fantastically important, and that we must have both approaches in our teaching. But I dare say that there's quite a lot of us in the profession who aren't doing that, aren't deliberately drawing on both of those, and then of course many other strategies as well. Discovery-led learning, for example, or mantle of the expert, sort of that you're there already and let's explore it as if you already know it. You know, there's so many different approaches, and I think one other thing to mention is, in your first piece there, you talked about a lot of people are finding that they are being instructed to use explicit instruction. I think that is problematic when we don't understand why. But there is a very, very, very strong case for why more explicit instruction, and that is, arguably, it is the best way to fill in the gaps for those who need gaps filled. It is very, very clear approach to making sure that nobody falls through the gaps. And I think more and more we are seeing students, children falling through the gap, and we didn't ought to let that happen.
James, I want to go back through that and pause and lift up loads of different things. So, but I just want to acknowledge that we've got a couple of people in the chat, and I should have said that at the beginning. If you're listening in live, please do join in, add your perspective, add questions, because I will definitely be looking at that and lifting those up. So it's great to see you, Penny. And we've got Maria, who I think, Maria, you're in Argentina, I think. So I don't know what time it is there. But Maria says that she completely agrees about not being very good at checking for understanding. So even in what you're sharing there, you know, as a teacher, I'm listening and thinking, oh, great, I could improve that. There's something I could do at 6 a.m. Oh, only 3 hours back. Okay. Yeah, so just listening to you, I am reflecting and thinking, these are the different ways from what you've said I might think about improving my practice. But you were talking about teachers kind of sometimes sticking to one pedagogy and then kind of repeating it because they find it works, right? It, you know, quote unquote, it works. It's having an impact. The kids are making progress. You know, teachers are busy. They've got a lot of workload. So it makes sense to be efficient in that way. Yet the challenge with that is you can get really stuck in your ways. And then in some talk I saw Guy give, he talks about pedagogy not being a personal matter. Like we've got to separate ourselves from our pedagogy. But pedagogy is a really personal matter because it, you know, we feel passionate about the way that we are creating learning experiences for students because they link to our values and they link to often the reason we came into teaching and learning, which is to make an impact on children's lives. So we get very stuck to the way that we are creating learning experiences, delivering curriculum. For example, I'm hugely passionate about play. If anyone told me kids shouldn't be playing, which is another thing that, you know, in some parts of the world we're being told, I would push back on that because it also comes to, I can't remember at what point and what you were saying, but it made me think of joy. Where's the joy? I want kids coming to school buzzing. I want them to be knocking the door down, literally saying, I cannot wait to get in that classroom to learn. If kids aren't doing that, I'm doing something wrong. Personally, I think. Other people don't have to agree with me. But, that first job I talked about here in Bristol, one of the reasons I knew I wanted to work at that school is because one of the teachers had up in their door, school should be the best party in town. I was like, hell yeah. Many schools aren't. They're really not. And you're talking about that kind of that balance and that difference between the kids that achieve. And again, we're talking about achievement, like we're talking about progress and achievement here within a system that has kind of like a measured curriculum that we have to get kids to understand, connect to. And then there are children who are slipping through or not wanting to come to school. And I don't know what the statistics are now in England, but about 5 years ago, it was like a 10% repeated absentee rate. That's telling us something. That is a big number of kids not wanting to come to school. So I think it's really, really important to be digging into, why is that? What's happening within the structure of what we're doing and the way that we are creating learning experiences that are making kids stressed and not wanting to come to school, and I think that's, for me, I put in one of the posts in LinkedIn, the invitation, or I don't know whether it's not an invitation, the requirement to teach more through explicit instruction. I'd worded it as misguided and potentially dangerous, because that's the danger. Because if we only teach in that method, and I've been in schools that have pushed for that, when those kind of messages have come in, the joy has gone out of learning because it's misinterpreted too. So I think that in that nuance is the bigger question of what's the point of school. That's the first of Guy Claxon's book I read, and it just resonated with me so much. What are we here for? What are we wanting to support children with? What is learning about? Those big, big questions, I feel, aren't really being kind of solidified and answered. And therefore we have a system that is a bit, well, what's the point of it? And what are we trying to do? So those are some of my thoughts. And one more, you were kind of talking about, no, in fact, two more. You were talking about potentially within that palette, kind of more of an inquiry approach and direct instruction being two parts of that palette, perhaps. Okay, this is a provocation. What if the entire palette was play? Or what if the entire palette was inquiry? What if inquiry were your stance and direct instruction were part of that palette? So I first heard this from Kath Murdoch, and I'm not sure if it directly comes from Kath, but using direct instruction just in time. So I think that's how it's worded. So you're using that at that moment when there's a misconception or there's something we need to focus on, or there's an approach, we need to pull together to look at this in more detail. And what's tending to happen in some areas of the world, I would say, in my experience teaching in England, this is the approach. The go-to is direct instruction or explicit instruction. And then you're lucky if you get to play or do a bit of inquiry around it. And I don't know if people listening find that too, but that's the danger, I think. There can be, you can sap all the joy out of learning. That's the danger. And I think joy is really important. I mean, it is scientifically too. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, James.
Yeah, so many topics and so many thoughts, Becky. It's yeah, I think I'm just searching for which of them to drill into a bit more. Actually, I think that phrase that what was it, that learning is the party. What was the phrase?
Our school should be the best party in town.
Yeah, I think put that in an early years environment and everyone's like you. Hell yes, of course, obviously. And I think the parents are absolutely on board with that because they want their young children to be joyful and to love it and to skip in and so on. I think if you put that in a high school, you would get a lot of people thinking, she's weird, isn't she? I bet she teaches drama. Like, oh, he's the wacky guy with the wacky tie. Do you know what I mean? And I think, yeah, we have to, yeah. I think there's something about.
What would the reframe on that be? If learning were to be engaging and enjoyable, and kids were dying to come to school in high school, what would the tagline be? You don't have to actually answer that, but that's the
Yeah, I mean, we simply we love learning. I think is or passionate about learning or something like that. And I'm not being disdainful of the phrase at all. I think that what would you see as you were talking, I was thinking that there's a quite a difference in phases here of education. In early years, whatever age that starts, and of course, in many countries it starts at 0, and sometimes it's at 3 years old, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, but whatever it is, early years is generally thought of as, in fact, as we call it in England, that foundational stage. It's creating those foundations, those deep roots of joy, of curiosity, of independence, of collaboration, of learning to be, learning about the world. It's much broader. But let's say you're teaching year 9 history, then what you're hearing all the time is content. What you're hearing all the time is you are rated according to the exam results that your kids get. Whereas in early phases of education, and I'm not just talking early years there, I am talking at least the first half of primary education. I think teaching is generally thought of. I mean, you said in your introduction that everyone was a good teacher. And I often think to myself, and not in a skeptical sense, but in a curious sense, how do you know? How do you know they're a good teacher? Is it because they're fun? Is it because they engage the kids? Is it because you go into their classroom and you think this is the kind of classroom I would love to be in? Whereas in high schools, although that is one element of their decision making, the biggest decision making is about, are the kids getting good exam results? And if they're not, well, sorry, Becky, you're going to have to stop being so groovy and stop swinging from the chandeliers here. And you're going to have to crack on with making sure that they know what they need to know to pass their exams. And so I think that's part of it, that it's what's our purpose, what's not just the expressed purpose, but also the subconscious, generally accepted purpose, and when I sent my children to early years, it was I wanted to see them loving to go in and making friends and being happy and making nice things and so on. Whereas, as my kids went through high school, a big part of it is, are they getting the grades that they need to move to be able to study the topics, the subjects that they want to study, to then be able to do the next part of their education, So yes, I want them to be happy. Of course I do. But it's also a big part of it is, yes, but we also need them to be able to get good grades. And if I might say, my son, so I've got 3 kids, and my son, he very much fell through the gap in education. And looking back, we made a mistake, I think, in terms of his education, not in terms of his community and his happiness, but in terms of his education, because he went to the village school, we could walk to, and it was a free-range chicken school where the kids just sort of potted around and they had fun, and they would very readily spill out onto the beach, and lessons would take place on the beach. And if it was a nice day, then lessons would pretty much be suspended and we'd be outside, and they'd be outside exploring and investigating and being curious. And we loved it, absolutely loved it, for all three of our kids. But that school were not rigorous with their teaching of numeracy and literacy. It was very, very inquiry-led, exploratory, and curious, which was brilliant for the kids who found literacy and numeracy made sense. For my son, numeracy always made sense. But for literacy, and we didn't know this, I mean, he's since been diagnosed autistic and ADHD and so on, but we didn't know that at the time. We just thought he was typical boy who, his first words didn't come out till he was almost 4 years old. There's all sorts of things going on, but we just thought, but he's happy. And he left that school with enormous gaps in his literacy, and that condemned him to failing in high school. And his entire high school could be summarized as fail. Because his literacy levels weren't there, he couldn't access any part of the curriculum, not even maths, in which he was brilliant. I mean, he's intuitive, he gets it, he knows the answer, but he can't explain it necessarily, but he knows the answer. But he can't read what's on the board quick enough to process it to be able to keep up with the lessons. So he ended up in special needs. And then, as he described it, Dad, there's the mainstream, and then there's the special needs, but I'm not even good enough to be in special needs. I'm right down in the dungeons with the serious special needs. And that hugely was down to the fact that literacy was happy-go-lucky, curious, inquiry-led, which worked brilliantly for my two daughters and was a complete disaster. Now, Harry, he's 16, and incidentally, I've never told you this, Becky, but I'm going to tell you now because it's exciting. So his high school education was a disaster, total disaster, but the school were brilliant in dealing with kids who had huge gaps in their education, like my son. And at the age of 14, they said, listen, we've got a plan. 2 days a week, he can come to school. And already he's thinking, fabulous, rather than 5 days, 2 days, you've got me. You had me at 2 days. 2 days a week at school, 2 days a week work experience, and 1 day a week going to a agricultural college. The 2 days a week work experience is at a local castle, working in the grounds, doing all sorts of things in the grounds with the livestock and the trees and goodness knows what. That castle has just been bought by Alan Carr and is going to be, Alan Carr, the chatty man, and he does that. So there's going to be a brand new series made by Disney called Castleman and Alan Carr, and it's about Alan Carr buying this castle and turning it into a hotel. And that's where my son works. And he's just got his chainsaw license. And so we can imagine, like, Alan Carr's doing all this Castleman stuff, and my son's in the background. Anyway, so I digress. So anyway, so Harry, he can hold a fabulous conversation. I mean, can you imagine growing up in this household? I mean, he's like proper inquiry. inquiry in his veins, you know. But the poor lad can't read and write. And so he's doing brilliantly at college, except that there's always this, but do I have to write stuff? And so I wish to goodness that we had been stronger in making sure that we filled those gaps, or the school did a much, much better job at filling the gaps, and they didn't. And of all the pedagogies I know of, direct instruction is the best way to fill those gaps. For my girls, they didn't need it because they love reading, they find language straightforward and easy, but Harry doesn't, and that's been hugely problematic. And so I think that in terms of equity, direct instruction is necessary, absolutely necessary. But also, there are many schools where it's almost entirely direct instruction. And so then the kids are not making those connections, are not lifting their head above the parapet and looking around and seeing what's going on in the world. They're not interested in what's going on politically, socially. Should we have a ban on phones for under, or social media for under 16s? You know, they're not asking those questions because they're not engaged in inquiry in school. And so, if I might say, we have to have both. And I'm sorry if for those kids who are falling through the gap, they will continue to fall through the gap unless we use direct instruction or explicit instruction. For those kids who are jumping through the hoops successfully, but have no imagination and curiosity, or rather they're not using imagination and curiosity, then they must have much more experience with inquiry. And so what's needed?
Yeah. And I remember you telling that story about your son when we were in Australia, and that really hit with me, you know. And that's one thing I really love about what you're offering. And when I listen to you, is first of all the kind of provocation and invitation to kind of step up and be mindful of what we're doing and be very aware that no pressure, educators, but every single move we make, everything we do has an impact. Every word we say, every learning experience we create. So when you were talking earlier on about the kind of this idea of the two history teachers, and one who might just always lecture and one who has like a very inquiry-led approach, you know, that those both, I don't know. Anyway, let's say, you know, you're in that state of doing the same thing all the time. You've gone unconscious in your practice. You're just not even aware of what you're doing. You're just running through the mill, and so are the kids, you know, and that's actually irresponsible as an educator to get into that state, because you've got children in your care. You know, that's a privilege. And then what you're talking about there, I was going to pick up before, is like the shadow side of different approaches. You know, so what you were describing with your son, and also I'm really sorry that happened, because that, you know, the knock-on effect of that. I know he's got a chainsaw now, but the
chainsaw license. We haven't bought him a chainsaw. Anyway, go on. Yeah.
This is something I want to see. Yeah. So and Penny says the story struck her too. You know, so it's just that the shadow side of, you know, just kind of summarizing what you're saying. If you only had more of a kind of, let's say, play-led, discovery-led, or like inquiry-led without direct instruction, which I don't think even, well, obviously it does exist, but I just can't imagine how it does, because it's all part of that to me. You know, you're running the risk of not enabling children to have some of those basic skills that are so essential, you know, and that's a disservice. And then, you know, if you're just teaching through like a more of an explicit approach, you're then doing the children a disservice of being open, curious, engaged, having their own agency, having their own direction in their learning, potentially having an impact on the world beyond them. I'm writing another book at the moment. I was just writing a chapter on agency and had have a case study of a project-based learning school in Cambodia. Those children were just, their confidence and their sense of, I can make an impact on the world, obviously, because they're doing projects that make an impact on their local and the whole country of Cambodia. Imagine going to a school like that where you're like, I can impact on the world and I'm only 8. So that piece can sometimes be missing from schools and classrooms, in my experience, and because we're so focused on the exams and the results, because that's what we're being measured against, and I think it's our responsibility as educators to really step back and think, but what's important to this child in front of me and this whole group of children in front of me and our entire school and our community. So David Price, who's passed away now, who was a big project-based advocate, used to talk about curriculum that serves community. And I just love that. It's so simple, but doesn't that flip? For me, working in English schools, so you'd often think about how can we connect with the community and how can we learn from our local community, but rarely did we ask, how can we serve the community, like in everything we do? And imagine that, schools that serve communities. For me, the Liger Leadership Academy that I visited in Cambodia, they were doing a huge service to their entire country. They had projects on deforestation and ocean pollution, and they were making like the very first Cambodian cookbook, and they were collaborating with a school in Australia to get feedback on how to make that accessible to an international audience, because you couldn't get the ingredients in the rest of the world. So yeah, there's this kind of feeling of the shadow side, and us as practitioners being very intentional and aware of the impact of what we do. And that can be very painful to examine in ourselves, because I think just the process of being a teacher, when I look back on my teaching career, I did things, I said things, I've made learning moves that of course negatively impacted on children as well as positively, and I think it's Maya Angelou who says, I can't remember the quote, but when you know better, do better, is basically the sense of what she's saying.
She says, do your best until you know better, and then do better. That's
it. Thank you. So it's that being able to separate ourselves from our pedagogy if we can. There's a school we work with that we're meeting with, Sandringham School. We're meeting with them in a couple of weeks. And one of their leadership team members, Louise, shared with me that when they have a leadership meeting and someone shares an idea, that idea is now on the table. It's no longer my idea. It's an idea that we're examining together. And that like physically separates you from the idea, so you're not taking things personally, so that this idea of us as reflective practitioners who are adaptable, don't take things personally, want to continually improve our craft, are open to completely changing, are open to new ideas. And just coming back to, this will be a nice segue actually, North Harrisdale, one of the teachers I observed there, and I've forgotten her name, that the STEM teacher who's next door to Kirsty.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I'll credit it afterwards if we can't remember, but if it comes to you, say, because I've written it's in one of my blog posts.
Yeah.
I mean, I loved her. She was like, me and Marie Whiteley went together. We walked into her classroom and she said, I've never done this before. I'm going to try using, and we can talk about this in a second, Ready, Fire, Aim, which I know you've renamed. We're using Makey. I've got these ideas, no idea how it's going to go. Could be a complete mess. Let's see. That was like basically what she said. Right. She had people observing her. I was like, I love this lady. And the lesson was a huge success. And what I mean by success is the children were massively engaged. They were figuring things out for themselves. You'll love this, James. When she said, we're going to be in the learning pit, they all went, yay! So they understood, because they understood what the learning pit was. They understood that meant grapple and challenge. And I also think the lesson was a success because they hadn't figured it out by the end of the lesson. She gathered them all together. We haven't figured it out yet. That's how learning happens. We're going to keep, we'll keep trying when we come back. And they were all buzzing because they haven't figured it out yet. They didn't need that closure. And I think that can also be problematic in teaching and learning if we have one lesson that by the end of the lesson you're going to have learned this and it's closed, done deal. And you had some really lovely things you shared in those conferences about leaving a lesson with a question continuing in your head. So maybe we can kind of transition into that a little bit. Some of the solutions pedagogically around this both and more approach that's like, we're not going to just do explicit instruction. We're not going to just play. We're not going to not that there's just play. We're not, we're going to have this palette of learning and learning approaches. What are some of the tools, techniques, kind of things we can use that kind of bring all of that together? And ready, fire, aim, as you're gonna, I know that you've upgraded the language and changed it. For me, that's one of the approaches in my own teaching that I've used in every single context I've been in. This idea of allowing children to figure things out for themselves and grapple. In Ron Berger's Expeditionary Learning, they talk about starting lesson with a grapple, which is similar to what you described. So could you talk about that a bit? Because that's a really great thing for people to take away.
Yes. And I think actually that's really helpful to frame this and what we should be doing. So let me just go back a stage. So ready, fire, aim. I first came across it from Guy Kawasaki, and I used it in my first book, which was published in 2010. And it's this idea that keep this introductory part short and sweet. That's the ready. And the fire is just go play with it. And then once you've played with it, you've got a much better sense of being able to aim, because you know now what worked, what didn't work, what kind of got there but didn't, but other times missed. And so it's that ready, fire, aim. Now, some people don't like the phrase because it sounds like you're shooting, and as you know, I do quite a lot of work in the States, and so it's often a political mistake to talk about shooting in any way, shape or form. So and I think it probably lends itself better in our profession to ready, play, refine. In terms of the teacher in North Harrisdale, it's something that I've encouraged a lot at that school, and I'm not saying I'm responsible for it, because their attitude and the leadership in the school is very much in sync with this. But I would say that almost always teacher mentoring, professional learning ought to take the approach of ready, play, refine. I shouldn't, you see, I was working with a school district in Oregon a few weeks ago, and they wanted me to observe the teachers and give feedback. And I said, well, no, I mean, what am I looking for? I'm only going to be looking through with my lens, and that's not your lens, it's not your community. But I would very happily work with you on a frame that I'd like to introduce to you, and we called it Ready, Teach, Refine. And so, for example, you and I, Becky, we pair up together. I ask you, what are you going to be teaching in the following lesson? You talk about that. I say, what would you like me to observe? What are the aspects of the children's learning that you would like me to look at? You then go and teach that lesson. and then together we talk about refinements, and then you use it in the next lesson after that. And so that lessons are we see it as experimental. So I'm not judging you at all. It is that you are deciding what is it that we're going to play with, try in the lesson, and then we're going to talk about how that play went and what we could do, what you could do to refine it. So ready, play, refine is one, the example there with teacher mentorship is, I think, much better than teacher observations, which I think are almost always dysfunctional. And I know leaders will try to say, oh, no, we do this, and this. Well, yeah, that's what the leaders say. Ask the teachers and get some real honest insight. And then you'll see that actually it's pretty dysfunctional. Unless the teachers get nice reviews, in which case it's no longer dysfunctional because it worked. So ready, play, refine, or ready, teach, refine, I think is brilliant. I think it's also a brilliant approach in lots and lots of circumstances. So what do we mean by being a friend? And then we play with that. We play with lots of ideas, and then we refine it. Works brilliantly. But I want you to have a go at playing with number value. Okay, just go and play with it, see how you get on, and see what conclusions you can draw from it. Well, no, I'm sorry, but no. I mean, there's just no, because there's so many opportunities to create misconceptions and then build on misconceptions. And
but then, but with that, because I was thinking a little bit because I use ready, play, refine. I use that a lot in my practice with young children, and especially here in England, but also in I was teaching in a PYP school in Switzerland, and I was kind of thinking about the real advantage of that is it allows for that inquiry within a kind of framework, within a kind of within a learning intention, I suppose. And where I use that with children, and I guess as well, it's because of the way I taught in general. And because obviously I'm coming from a learning power approach background, I had children, I had coached children into being great collaborators, great at persevering. They were hungry to challenge themselves. They knew that trying out new ideas was going to discover new outcomes. So we had all of that attitude for learning already kind of as part of our ethos. But where I allowed them to explore, and it could be almost anything, but I wouldn't let them explore like place value, or we were looking at patterns, and they had a lot of different things they could create, quite open-ended, because we were learning about patterns in number. But the first exploration was around what kind of patterns can you discover. They discovered, like in their pairs, one pair discovered what was triangular numbers, basically the patterns of triangular numbers. Other children were looking at what was actually the basis of fractals. So it's like, these are 5 and 6 year olds. So I actually feel like that frame leaves a lovely opportunity for something quite big to open up that you can then ground and take one angle on, and also say, and isn't that investigation you've done on what is basically triangle numbers really interesting? I wonder how we could continue that. And then that can feed into like home learning, and we use seesaw. So then that connects with parents. Imagine being a parent, finding out your 5-year-old's discovered triangular numbers and has been investigating into that. So I think, that frame is a really great one to take the cap off learning, I think,
Yes, I agree. Absolutely. And it sounds fascinating. I think the key here, though, is if I can go back to the original frame, because so rather than use play for now, because I know that's of course means a lot to a lot of people, yourself particularly. But if I can use ready, fire, aim, inquiry could be defined as ready, fire, aim. Explicit instruction would be defined as ready, aim, fire.
Mm.
And I hadn't thought of it until now, but I think that's probably the elevator pitch is, well, what's the difference? My inquiry is ready, fire, aim, and explicit instruction is ready, aim, fire. And you're not allowed to fire until you've proved your aim is spot on. And so then it becomes, what's the purpose? Not only the purpose in terms of the child's need, but also the content and the context. And so if there are many aspects of the curriculum in which ready, fire, aim lends itself brilliantly. When it's somewhat open, somewhat philosophical, somewhat based upon perspective, view, opinion, connection, then I think inquiry lends itself absolutely brilliantly. And I wish more teachers would use inquiry. However, there are many parts of the curriculum for which that would actually be either dangerous, like literally dangerous, or it could risk misconceptions that, if those misconceptions aren't corrected, could lead to all sorts of problems later on. And so explicit instruction is ready, aim. If you proved it, if you showed it, am I absolutely sure that you've got the aim right? Okay, now try, now fire. And so it's down to, what do you need and what's needed right now? And if I circle back to my son, almost his entire schooling was ready, fire, aim. But the problem is, he was so exhausted from the firing, he didn't really have any energy left to concentrate on the aim. And there wasn't enough ready, aim, fire. And I think with explicit instruction, it can seem as if it's quite pedestrian in its pace. But what it's doing is making sure that every single child is, when they are at the fire stage, the independent practice stage, we are as confident as it's possible to be that those kids are going to practice the right thing, the accurate thing, the correct thing, and not build on misconceptions. And that's why it's an equity practice. So, for example, if I'm teaching, I don't know, long multiplication, for example, explicit instruction, first of all, you get rid of all the fluff. There's no extra bits. There's no, I noticed somebody had mentioned edutainer. I can't see it at the minute, but in the chat there was a mention. There's no edutainment at all. It's, you remove the fluff, you remove the cognitive load, if you want to use this the cognitive science term. You remove that, and it's just done. Okay, children, we're going to be doing long multiplication today. Here is the method I need you all to know by the end of the lesson. Some of you might already know it. We're going to make absolutely sure you've got the exact process. We're then going to practice it together. And then when you've demonstrated to me that you've got it, you can practice independently. So here is what long multiplication looks like. And you do, and incidentally, best practice with explicit instruction is you would not be turning around and writing on the board. That's a crazy aspect of it. We would have a doc cam or hover cam or whatever you want to call it. You would be standing at the front. You would have all the children in front of you. You're using your peripheral vision to check that every single student is watching what's going on. You are writing on the screen that you've got that's then projecting behind you. You're expecting every single child to watch. You are doing the operation, and you are verbalizing your thinking as you go, without the fluff. Then the second step is guided practice. But guided practice seems like it's really slow, but it's actually very deliberate and careful. So I want you all to write 17. Everybody on your mini whiteboards write 17. And now put the 8, because we're going to do multiply 17 times 8. We're going to put the 8 directly under the 7, exactly as I've got it on the screen. And I'm using my peripheral vision to make sure everybody, not most, not the good kids, but everybody is writing that. Now, for some kids, they think, oh, flipping heck, come on. But there's a lot of kids, if you've, and of course, you're only using this if you've determined that there's actually quite a lot of kids for who that they've fallen through the gap. Then, right, everybody draw the line. So we're using the column method. What I mean by column is we've got a column for ones, we've got a column for 10, and so on, so on, so on, so on. Okay. So, and I work it through with them, and I'm doing, everybody's doing it, and we do it. So it's not, here's 3 problems, now do them. It's you do that very, very, very deliberately. Then you do a second one. Then you give some examples, but just 1 or 2 for them to try. Now, of course, you know the kids typically, and so you know that there's some kids who are likely, who have got it so solidly that you're going to be able to release them into the independent practice very, very quickly, and then add challenge and so on. But you know also there's some other kids who aren't there yet. And often what happens in classrooms is everyone's working on most of the stuff, but then you've got your special needs kids who've got a teaching assistant who are going through the very slow, deliberate thing. And guess what they're thinking? You know, they're looking around, seeing all their mates getting on with it. And then they've got this teaching assistant sat with them and kind of doing it very slowly. And it's really problematic because it builds that sense of I'm stupid, I can't do this. And so that's an example. And you, with those kids, let's say there's a third of them in the class who just don't know how to do long multiplication. Ready, fire, aim is not the right pedagogy for them. And yet for 2/3, it probably would have been. And so I'm making a decision to use explicit instruction to make sure that every single child, every single one of them, can do long multiplication accurately and correctly and know why. Now, some of them will race on to doing complex long multiplication and using different methods and not just the algorithm or the column method. They go to the box method, they go to looking at patterns. Okay, so actually 19 multiplied by 19 is close to 20, and therefore, you know, etc., etc., etc. So that, but I'm making absolutely sure that every single child is confident and clear and accurate with that column method. Now, Becca, you know I do lots and lots and lots and lots of demonstration lessons. Just give me any class of kids and I'll work with them. And I have never, ever, ever done a demonstration lesson where 100% of the kids know how to do long multiplication. And that's in middle school and that's in high school. So somewhere along the line, there's some kids falling through the gap. Why? Why are we allowing that? What's going on? And so that's what direct instruction is generally. It's not chalk and talk. It's not lecturing. It's not overhead projected. It's not death by slides. It is that very, very, very deliberate aspect. I haven't ever seen explicit instruction working well without mini whiteboards where every single student is doing it, or the digital equivalent, but we know about the problems with that digital equivalent. It is very, very robust and clear in that. That's good practice. There are many, many versions of explicit instruction that actually are very, very poor practice, in the same way that you and I would see good practice, inquiry-led learning, and some very poor practice with inquiry-led learning. So we are talking scales here, but I think if we come back to that ready, fire, aim, that's amazing and brilliant for so many contexts, for so many reasons, and that's more like inquiry. But at other times we must do ready, aim, fire, and that's explicit instruction.
Yeah, thank you for describing that so clearly, James. And it really makes me think, I don't think I've ever been in any school that has defined any pedagogy, you know, that any part of this palette, what is it, what it looks like, this is exactly, you know, this is exactly what it looks like and the impact it's having and why we're doing it. So
Yeah.
that's leaving educators, teachers doing that themselves, either well or not, or anything in between, you know. So that very clear what it is and what it isn't, what it looks like done well, what it looks like done poorly, and why the impact of those poor actions and the impact of those, you know, when you've done it well and what you're looking for, that's so important. So that makes me kind of think about clarity. And it makes me think, I don't know whether you've seen in one of Art Costa's book, he's got a really good visual that's split up like this screen in half. And on one side, it's got arrows pointing in loads of different directions. And on the other, all the arrows are aligned, pointing in the same direction. And it's speaking to whole school ethos, you know, and how well the members in your team understand the ethos of your school. And it could be you could apply it to so many situations, but you could apply it to what's our understanding of explicit instruction. I would say in most schools, the arrows would be from classroom to classroom to classroom, the interpretation of and delivery of an explicit instruction lesson would be different, you know. And how well would those teachers know what they're doing and why? And I would include myself within that. That's like that's not a projection looking outside of myself. How well would I know my own practice and know that the moves I was making, the choice I'd made in terms of pedagogy was the right one for the right moment, like you were saying about the kind of inner thinking of 2/3 of the class need this and 1/3 don't so much, but we're going to make sure everyone's got it. And then, you know, how would I know what impact I was having? I want to pick up on some of the comments because I promised I would, and there's some really good comments coming in. So the one that you shared.
Can I jump in on that, Becky, to link to a comment? So Annika says setting outcomes can be very restrictive. We're in danger of missing some very exciting things along the way. And I think that links to what you've just said there, that I agree that they can be, but they can also not be. And it's entirely down to how we do it, entirely down to how well are we doing them, because setting outcomes can be very, 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 very powerful indeed and allow for all sorts of curiosity and play and investigation if you get the outcomes right. But they can also, as Annika says, be very, very restrictive indeed. You know, it depends what we're defining as the outcomes. We are so the outcome that I've just described to you for the long multiplication, that is very, very clearly defined. By the end of this lesson, all of us will be able to do the column method for long multiplication. I don't know if that's restrictive. Now, I can think of lots of examples in which it would be restrictive, but so long as I'm clear about how much freedom do I need, how much openness, you know, it could be we are thinking about the importance of numbers. That's very open, isn't it? Very broad, and we could have an amazing inquiry about that. You know, I can't remember the exact details, but was it that because the Romans didn't have a zero, did they? And it was, I can't remember who invented or decided we needed a zero, because before that there was no digit or there was no concept of zero, you know. So we could explore that. Or is everything a number? Do we need numbers? You know, so that's really very interesting. What fascinating inquiry the other day is, should we have base 10 or base 12? Oh, it's just brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And they were having a really robust discussion, and then the teacher says, well, you know where base 12 comes from? And they gave brilliant, because our fingers, they've got 3 parts. Each finger's got 3 parts, and then your thumb is used as your counter. So you can the 3 parts, of course, 3 goes into 12 very, very nicely, because you've got 4 fingers. Each of the fingers has got 3 parts, so there's 12, and there you've got your 12 to count really easily. And 12 is much more divisible than 10 is. much more divisible, and that's why we've got 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes. And it was just like, oh my god, my head was blown. Now, but that teacher introduced that information during the inquiry, but she was able to let the inquiry be free roaming and get the kids to think about it and to find that they are fascinated by numbers. And then for her to introduce that information, it was just brilliant. But I might say, right, children, we're going to be learning about base 12 today. And the kids are like, you know, so I want to use inquiry first to get them really, really interested. So it's what Annika's point about setting outcomes. Well, yeah, what is your outcome? With that explicit instruction example, my outcome's much tighter because my intention is much tighter. But with the inquiry, we're going to be thinking about time, or we're going to be thinking about numbers, or, you know. So I think we can create outcomes to suit that purpose as well.
I like that lens in terms of thinking about making it more restricted and tighter and opening up. It's almost like you could use that within the palette, you know, of intentionality, you know, and how restricted am I making this and why? But, you know, and just that, even that as a discussion point as we're planning learning in our teams, and just kind of segueing this into kind of the part of the purpose of us having this discussion, apart from it just being fun, to kind of play around and be intentional and, you know, think about what we're doing and why. You know, where teachers, schools are being asked to mostly teach through explicit instruction. You know, I hope that even in what we've been talking about, your dog agrees, even in what we've been talking about, that there's intentionality, that there's strategy here to put into place and think about, and to be able to say to somebody, we're using Ready, Fire, Aim today in this way because X, Y, Z, and this is the impact we're looking for.
Absolutely.
That for me is
really intentional. Yeah.
I was going to so the book that I'm writing is titled Learning Pioneers now, but it was going to be titled Empowered Through Pedagogy. And that's the idea, that if we know our pedagogy really well, in the way that you've been describing, that we can make the implicit explicit, we know what we're doing and why, we know when to tighten, when to loosen, then nobody can tell us what to do because we know what we're doing and we know why we're doing it. So for me, in terms of outside agencies coming in and saying, you have to do it this way, that understanding of pedagogy, that deep understanding of pedagogy, is the defense, for want of a better word, in keeping true to what we know is nourishing, helping, inspiring our students, and helping them make progress and achieve. I mean, that's kind of the dream goal, isn't it? All of it. What, you know, we don't need to choose one or the other, but, you know, it's the whole thing. It's joyful and it's challenging, and we get great exam results, and we're lifelong learners, and we love coming to school, all of it.
Yeah, agreed, absolutely. I've got quite a lot to respond to that, but I know you want to get onto the questions as well from the chat, so
respond. And then, like, you
about
actually lifted up Annika's comment, which I really wanted to lift up, and Julia Scrimshaw shared something really interesting too. But no, come back on that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, very quickly then, and at the risk of being very England-centric, and I don't mean to be, because we do have people from lots of different parts of the world, but a quick example of what you've just said there was, you were probably teaching in Bristol at the time, but I remember very clearly it would be 1996, 97, 98, something like that, the late 90s at least, where the Department for Education in England decided that we were all going to do the literacy hour and the numeracy hour, and we were told that we would be doing 1 hour on literacy, and before that it'd been English and maths, and then it became literacy and numeracy, and we were all given this training on the literacy hour and the numeracy hour. And I was at the time teaching in a middle school, and I remember back then, the general attitude was, what the hell? Why are we even doing this? Why are we being told to do this? Typical government telling us what to do. And so there was very much arms folded, and there was a sense of, let's just do it for the sake of doing it kind of thing, you know, because it had been introduced with that top down without any reasoning at all. And if the reasoning were given, it certainly hadn't filtered through to us in the classroom. But you know what? I mean, I've still got, look at this. This is from the archive here. This is the National Numeracy Strategy. This is the pack that was used to train in the numeracy. And I tell you what, when you look at it now, it's brilliant. There is absolutely superb stuff in here. Did we think it was superb? No, because we had been told to do it, because we didn't know the reason for it. And bear in mind, this was a middle school. So this is like the top 2 years of primary and the bottom 2 years of high school all kind of squished into one. And so it was a real weird mix of, some of us were primary teachers and we thought, oh yeah, interesting, let's build the whole child. And then some were secondary teachers and let's teach the subject. And, you know, then there was this mesh. Yeah. And yet it's brilliant. There's some brilliant stuff in there, but it was introduced in the wrong way. And so I think we have to be really careful about this as well. I mean, explicit instruction is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And I wish to goodness my son had been exposed to explicit instruction, and the explicit instruction that I tried to describe earlier, not the lecture, not the chalk and talk, not what a lot of people think explicit instruction is. But the same goes for inquiry. I mean, you know, inquiry can be brilliant, but it can also be really flabby and rudderless. You know, I think the best approach I've ever come across to summarize it is, you are providing the headwind for the kids, and so they can't just go straight forward. They have to tack back and forth, but they're still aiming for port. Now, what's the port? And it's not they all know this or they all think this. It's they have explored what number means or how important number is, you know, something like that. So that's back to the outcome. So I think, you know, yeah, intentionality, Becky, is massively important. Intentionality and the sense of purpose. You know, why are we doing what we're doing? You know, I think that's really, really hugely important. We can't use the phrase, it's for the kids. Well, we can. Yeah. Everything's for the kids. Ultimately, you know, so we have to be much more defined in that, I think, in what's the purpose here. Julia remembers it. Julia, you're showing your age. You remember the numeracy hour, literacy hour.
And you were saying that was in 1996. I was in school then still, James.
Give over. I'm sorry. Honestly, Julia,
I do remember the folder you showed me was part of my PGCE, and that was in 2005. So that stood the test of time a little bit, didn't it? That was... Yeah.
Move on. Next question.
But there's a couple of things in that, just in terms of how things are introduced. I mean, we're kind of talking from a governmental level there, but rinse and repeat in schools, because when we build something with agency with teachers, they want to be part of that. You know, in schools I've taught him where we're part of shaping our ethos and we have that agency, and our curiosities, interests, areas of growth are valued and encouraged. I've loved, you know, being in those schools where there's been like a top down, you're doing this and, you know, just put up and shut up and that's the way we're doing it. You know, I'm not going to last in that place, you know, so there's nothing we can do. And I mean, there are things we can do. We don't have as much agency around what comes down from the government, but we do have agency in the way we receive that, in the way that you were describing. You know, so when something has come down and it's like, you must do it this way, and then that hasn't been, it hasn't been articulated why, we've got a choice then. We can either, you know, like you said, cross our arms, push back and say, well, I'm not going to do that, or I'll do it, you know, dragging my feet. Or we can try and build compassion and empathy and understanding and think, well, where might that have come from? What good can I take from this? How can I incorporate it into what I'm already doing? Or do you know what? We're already doing that, and we're doing this. So no change needed, you know? So, and I think in, you know, and again, on a school level, in the schools I've taught in, where the ethos, communication, belief in teachers has been strong, anything that came in from the outside wouldn't have shaken that ship, because it's so that leadership structure where the pedagogy is very well embedded, where teachers are learning from one another, where there's like a coaching structure like the one you were describing, where teachers are co-observing, or the observation process is very is a learning process, not a judgment. You know, those schools are really strong in what they're doing, whereas I've been in schools where they haven't fully understood what they're doing and why. There's a bit of a kind of flaky approach, perhaps. Quite often in those schools, leadership haven't got a strong pedagogical understanding or approach, and then anything that comes in can shake that ship and blow it, and it can crumble. I've been in schools where that has completely crumbled from an outside kind of directive, and then it's crumbled and got toxic very, very quickly. You know, so the answer to me is know your pedagogy well, and know your pedagogy well with your team, and build agency with your team in that process. And, you know, I'm sure you do too. I'm sure North Harrisdale are like this. But, you know, I know schools who are very strong in that. And it's because the leadership pay close attention to what they're conscious in what they're doing. They don't fall unconscious, and they don't allow their teachers to fall unconscious in how they're delivering.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah. And yes. And I think also it's how we are, not to open another can of worms, but let's do so, to how we are judging the success of that. And one of the indicators ought to be very, very robust systems, procedures to check the learning of the students. And grades are not enough. We know that. But then what else are we using? And there's a lot of schools where the check is, are the kids getting on all right? Do they seem to be doing okay? Are their attitudes good? Have we got rid of bad behavior? You know, and I think we have to be really, really robust in defining and understanding progress, so that, is my teaching working? Well, one strong core element of answering that ought to be, here's my progress evidence to show that they are making superb progress, not just good progress. I mean, you know, John Hattie's synthesis of all those meta-analyses, and identified that the average amount of progress that students make in a year as an effect size was 0.4. But there's another part of the message that often doesn't get repeated, and that is the kids who don't go to school, and there's millions of them for religious and cultural and geographical health reasons, their progress is 0.2. So in other words, kids are going to be making progress. Kids are going to be learning, whether they go to school or not, just by experiencing, existing, interacting. They're going to be making progress. So it's not enough to say, well, by the end of year 2, they're better than they were at the beginning of year 2. Well, I certainly hope so. Of course they are. And they didn't need to attend school to be better. You know, so it's, are we helping them to make superb progress? And what do we mean by superb progress? And what's our evidence for that? You know, I think we have to be really clear about that. So we're not just checking pedagogy in terms of, were the children visually engaged? You know, when I look around the room, they're all at it. Well, yes, but were they learning? You know, I think I told you this story, but I saw some kids in a science lesson, and 35 kids, every single one of them were totally wrapped in what the teacher was doing. And she had an experiment going on. She'd put some paper at the bottom of a glass vase, lit the paper, put a boiled egg on the top that she'd peeled. And as the paper was burning, the boiled egg was wobbling like this. And then ultimately the egg got sucked into the jar. And the kids are like, whoa! I mean, it was just total engagement. Except that when I asked the kids later, so what did you see there then? Magic! I was like, what? Yeah, our teacher's a magician. Oh, yeah, okay. She is. So what's the science of it? Well, I don't know, it's magic. And not one of them knew what the science was behind it. But they all loved the experiment. They all loved the magic. That's an example of edutainment in a sense, as Rukia has mentioned edutainment, and I think we do have to be engaging, of course we do, but we also have to be engaging with a purpose. I mean, listen, if you want engaged kids, bring the circus in, because they're way more entertaining than you are. I'm sorry, Becky. I mean, you are lovely, but you're not as entertaining as the circus is. So just, if that's all we're looking for is edutainment and engagement. No, what we want to do is, in that example, we want to engage them in the science. So how about, in this example, we do ready, we then aim. So we talk about the science and the creating of a vacuum and the burning of oxygen, and then there's a vacuum, and then we explain what's going to happen, then we observe it. So now it's ready, aim, fire, and then we look again at the aim. So it's ready, aim, fire, aim. Do you see what I mean? But how do I know which is the right approach? Well, I need to be thinking very clearly about what's the outcomes that I want. Well, I want every single student to know that when oxygen is burned, it creates a vacuum. If it's in a closed container, it creates a vacuum. And if a vacuum will then, that's the pressure is different to the atmospheric pressure, and therefore, and so on and so on and so on. I need them to know that. And now how am I going to engage them in that science, not in the magic? Engage them in the science. And so then that comes down to, again, what's our purpose? Because honestly, at the face of it, and I was with the principal and the deputy principal, and we were watching this, and this is amazing. And guess what? The deputy said, oh, yeah, she's one of our best teachers. She's absolutely brilliant. And I mean, she was absolutely lovely and thoroughly lovely, engaging person. The kids obviously loved her. So, yeah, but not one of the kids knew the science at the end of it.
Yeah, I'm surprised we've only, just mentioned John Hattie's meta research, because we could do a whole other StreamYard looking at that, because I heard John Hattie speak here in London a couple of years ago, and obviously you refer to his meta research a lot, and we embed it into Learning Pioneers a lot, because it's so important to be thinking about that kind of, okay, well, what's making that kind of extra progress? But just in what you were describing there, was the relationships, that has a high effect size, isn't it? I think it's 0.6. I think I almost know the actual effect size, rather than just being high or low. But that kind of having a rapport with your students and building those relationships, well, it just makes logical sense that would enable more progress and learning, because kids want to learn for teachers they have a connection with. But what you're describing there,
True.
Apart from the fact
but it's not enough, is it? It's not enough in itself.
No.
There's kids who love the drama teacher, absolutely love it, but what are they learning from it? Well, maybe they are actually learning huge amounts, and look at the productions they're putting on, and they can talk about theatre, and they can talk about the aspects and the moves and the science of theatre, as well as the drama of theatre and so on. But others just say, oh, it's brilliant, you don't have to write anything. You get to play all these games. And they absolutely love the drama teacher.
Yeah.
But what are they learning? So it's got to be both, hasn't it? It has to be absolutely. But of course, you could have a teacher who absolutely knows their subject inside out and upside down, but the kids just think, this teacher, goodness sake, I'll do anything to get out of his lesson. So absolutely, relationships are hugely, hugely important, but in and of themselves are not enough.
100%. And just we're going to need to wrap up. We've got like 30 seconds, but we can stay a couple of minutes over. I was just thinking about the main the main things that have the biggest effect size. So you know this better than I do, but from what I remember and what I know, building relationships has a high effect size. Creating challenging learning and making learning challenging has a high effect size. Now that's a whole can of worms, because what do we even mean by that, and what does it look like? Again, coming back to Art Costa's visual, I think if you ask, excuse me, different teachers, what does challenging learning look like, you're going to get 100 different answers from 100 different teachers. And collective efficacy and learning to learn. So like having that kind of lifelong learning. Those are the ones that I know of that have some of the highest effect sizes. And we haven't got long to, we're not going to be able to unpick that. But am I kind of roughly in the right ballpark? And is there anything you'd add to that?
So much to add to that.
Add one thing. You're only allowed to add one.
I don't know how to. I don't know. I'm also somewhat distracted by there's a lot of really, really great comments to respond to. But yes, caveat is that each one of those are important, but of course none of them exist in isolation, and some are more equal than others, let's just say. And we have to be really careful about going for one of the things that John Hattie regrets is publishing a league table, in effect, of effect sizes, because then people did almost see it as a shopping list, and let's do the ones at the top and not the ones at the bottom. Well, one of the ones very close to the bottom is growth mindset, and yet I will die on the hill about growth mindset. I mean, getting everybody into a growth mindset makes an enormous difference, and yet the effect size is very small, but there's all sorts of reasons for that, and but that's a whole other StreamYard.
And James, I'll just speak to, like, mostly with these StreamYards I've been running, I haven't been really plugging stuff because I just want it to be a great conversation, but I want to plug your PDOD because your videos are so clear in terms of like introducing the learning pit correctly and in an effective way. And what were we just talking about? Because I know you got growth mindset and fixed mindset. You do a brilliant, I think it's one of your challenge videos that frames growth and fixed mindset within that being the baseline from which you build so much else. So I just think in terms of, if anyone was listening to this and feeling a bit stuck in articulating pedagogy and knowing what they're doing and why, you explain things so clearly in those videos. So I am going to make a plug for your PDOD because I just think that would be just a really obvious, useful step if you want to just think a bit more intentionally about these things. Really great. I mean, a great idea. You've put a huge amount of love and effort into that. And it's like a kind of visual learning book. So I would guide people to that.
Thank you very much, Becky. Yeah, I'm actually pretty proud of it. And typically I create things and go, but the videos I'm very proud of. So it's pd-od.com. Yeah. Professional development on demand, or professional development overdose if you prefer. But I don't mind which one you call it, but yeah.
And just wrapping things up, I'd love, because we've still got people here in the chat, so thanks for staying for the whole time, but any key takeaways, one idea that you're going to take away with you, one thing you're going to put into action, and kind of same wrap up for you, James. What are you leaving wondering about? What will you be wondering about moving forward?
I'm going to be wondering about the comments. Actually, there's some really, really interesting comments. I think we could have done a whole session just on reading the comments and responding to them. I'm going to be thinking a lot about that. I think, was it Julia mentioned? Somebody had written about it would be useful to have a compendium of what we mean by these approaches.
That's a really good shout out. There you go. More videos, please, James.
Exactly. Yeah.
But imagine that in any school. I mean, that's just a really good lift up. Imagine that in any school, a compendium of this is our palette of approaches, and this is what we mean by that. Even video footage of what that looks like in action, because there's always that invitation in schools, go and observe this person and go and see that. And of course we can make time for that, and we're time poor. So imagine a like kind of compendium of these are our learning approaches. This is what we mean.
It's almost as if there's a library of videos that does exactly that.
Yeah.
Think of that. That's exactly what
some of those
that's
things.
exactly what the point is.
Yeah.
These are here you go. This is what we mean by growth mindset. This is what it looks like in practice. These are the nuances. Same for feedback, same for explicit instruction, same for challenge, same for dialogue, same for inquiry. That's exactly the approach I've taken.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for making time this morning, James, after all you're flying around. And everyone, thank you so much for coming and all your brilliant comments and feedback. And same thing, they'll all show up on LinkedIn, James, so you'll be able to go in and have a look and respond and take them away and ponder on them.
Great.
Right, have a lovely Friday, James, and everyone else have a lovely Friday, whatever time it is for you. And Maria, go get a coffee, since it might be about 8 a.m. now.
Right. Yeah, brilliant.
Thanks,
all right.
James.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.